Welcome, Sarah, and welcome again to everyone who's still in the room or who has just joined us. So, Sarah, please start your presentation. The stage is all yours.
Stefan and Adobe, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. And thank you to all the participants, especially those of you who are listening to this live somewhere in Asia, probably in the middle of the night. It's also getting a little late over in Germany. So thank you for being here. And I look forward to talking with you about this. I definitely want to have some time for questions. I'll take those at the end of the presentation. I actually can't see them at the moment because of the screen sharing. So I'm not ignoring you. I just absolutely cannot see you. So I want to talk to you today about DITA and FrameMaker, specifically FrameMaker 2015, and what sorts of things you could do to put those two things together and what your options are. Before we go down that road, a couple of things about me. I run a company called Scriptorium Publishing. We do mostly enterprise content strategy consulting. We're based in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. And about 80% of the work that we do is XML. We do some content strategy assessments. We help customers analyze their content requirements. We build workflows that support those business goals. But from there, when we go to implementation, about 80% of what we do is XML, and about 80% of that XML work is DITA related. So we do an awful lot of DITA work, but we are not exclusively a DITA shop. Another thing you should know that's important is that we are vendor agnostic. We do not resell software or accept referral fees from software vendors. And my favorite bullet point, which I have just added to this slide, is that in 2017, starting in January, in fact, we are celebrating 20 years in business. I started, of course, when I was about 10 years old. And that's how we got to this point. So I'm really actually very excited about that and about sharing some of that with you in 2017, some of our history for those of you that haven't been along for the ride for the past 20 years. Okay, a couple of important things. And in this context, the comment in the chat from one of the attendees might make a little more sense. Things that I like, in addition to chocolate and knitting, are things like predictable output, smooth localization, clear metrics, automation, and concise writing. Things that I do not like include eggplant, checked baggage, recurring tasks, workarounds, busy work, bad content, repetitive tasks that are not value added. I like to make the computer do things instead of doing it myself. Some would say that's lazy. I say it's efficient. So, a couple of things for today. The things I want to talk to today are basically what sort of workflow components you have for DITA in general, how FrameMaker fits into that, a little bit about authoring, publishing, how you put those together, a couple of other Adobe tools, and finally, how you might mix structured and unstructured content. So, kind of a lot of ground to cover here, but we'll see what we can do. Let's start with the basics. In a DITA, or for that matter, a generic XML workflow, you are going to have something that looks like this. You have a process for authoring and maybe a tool. You have a process for publishing and maybe another tool, or perhaps even multiple tools. And then you have your deliverables, of which the most common clearly are PDF and HTML, but there could be other things there as well. So everything that I look at a simple level breaks down into these three layers that we have to deal with. Now, let's talk a little bit about what that means. The authoring layer is where you create DITA content, map files, relationship tables, all those things that go along with them. And your authoring tool, it is of course technically possible to author DITA content in Notepad, in just a plain vanilla text editor with no features, but it's terrible. It's a terrible experience. So what you want is an authoring tool that supports the important DITA features, tables, images, conrefs, keys, and some of the other things that are out there, relationship tables, that kind of thing. So when I say authoring tool, I'm talking specifically about the subset of content creation tools that know and understand DITA and that allow you to actually create that stuff. Okay, so that's authoring. Now, publishing in this context is the ability to create output from DITA content. And there are lots of things you might need to do here, PDF, HTML, and then this grand category of other. I've listed a few things here that I've actually been asked to produce from DITA over the years. There is much, much more, but certainly man pages, which are Unix kinds of things, wiki output, DITA to Word, that's always horrifying, but usually that's so that somebody downstream can actually update or edit the Word files and then the content comes back. It's sort of like single sourcing circa 1988. Kindle, Mobi format, EPUB, of course, InDesign. We've been asked to produce InDesign content from DITA. JSON, that's a delightful and not very much fun approach, and resource files, which are typically for UI strings. So when you want to take the labels on your interface, like file and print and save as, and localize those, you need resource files to manage those. So those usually go into software. So that's the publishing layer. And then our deliverable layer is the final product, content in a package ready for users to consume. And again, this could take a variety of formats. I've basically given you the two most common ones, but that should be a stand-in for all the other formats you might possibly need ever. Okay, so back to our workflow components here. We have three of them. And what I've done here is highlighted authoring, because we can fit FrameMaker into this authoring, publishing, deliverable workflow in several different ways. There's a 100% FrameMaker approach, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but there's also this sort of partial approach where you use FrameMaker only for one or some of the components that you're dealing with. So if you use FrameMaker for authoring, and I will tell you this is not a common workflow, because using it for authoring and not publishing is a little odd, because of course it has excellent PDF output support. So, but I have seen this. We have one customer that uses this approach. In the old, and we think it's a sort of a historical artifact. So in the olden days, they wrote in FrameMaker and produced these sort of classroom training guides. And then they moved over to Structure, and when they went to Structure, most of their training became e-learning. So they're no longer really producing a lot of PDF. They're producing e-learning content. And what they had us do, or what they had us help them do, was configure a workflow in which they author in FrameMaker, and then they export from FrameMaker to a very strange and customized XML format, which they then consume in their learning management system to produce the e-learning that they need. So their training materials are electronic. They author in structured FrameMaker, export to custom XML, and then ingest that into yet another custom system. Now, again, not a very common workflow, but certainly one that you could take. FrameMaker in the publishing layer is a much more common thing because, again, it does an excellent job of producing PDF and is technologically much easier to configure than some of your other options. You can use FrameMaker's PDF output in combination with some sort of an external XML authoring environment. So what we're talking about here is that you have an XML editor of some sort, and then when you're done creating your content, you push it into FrameMaker to publish to PDF. This is something that we see a good bit of. I mean, I would say this is actually a reasonable percentage of what we look at. We've also seen this done with InDesign, but it's significantly difficult to do with InDesign and pretty easy to do with FrameMaker and DITA. So then we start thinking about what are some of our other options, and then you sort of get into this, okay, well, let's use FrameMaker for authoring and publishing. This approach, I think, is most common among organizations that are moving from unstructured FrameMaker, that started with unstructured FrameMaker, are now moving to DITA and structured FrameMaker, because what you can do is you can preserve the assets that you have, your unstructured FrameMaker templates, in the structured FrameMaker environment. You may need to do some work to reconfigure or align or adjust them, but a lot of that work is then already done. Now, the other thing that's interesting here is that there is a perceived advantage that authors get to keep their tool. We get to keep our tool, we get to keep FrameMaker, and we are happy. Now, it is true that you can certainly use unstructured and structured FrameMaker on a single license, right? When you buy FrameMaker, you get both. And the overall licensing cost is therefore reduced because you don't have to go buy another tool. But I think it's worth noting that the authoring experience, the user experience in structured and unstructured FrameMaker is in no way the same. So this is a case where authors tend to perceive that, oh, it's the same thing still, but it's not. So there's a bit of a misconception there, but we cheerfully use it to our advantage if it means that the authors will be happier to make that transition over to structure. All right. So if you use FrameMaker for authoring and publishing, then you are probably going to use it to publish to PDF. You might have a separate workflow for HTML and for some of your other, especially some of your weirder deliverables. So in this world, what you might be looking at is using the Ditto Open Toolkit to generate HTML and related deliverables, EPUB, that kind of thing, and FrameMaker to generate PDF. You might also look at some third-party tools, something like a WebWorks ePublisher, to generate other kinds of outputs. But in this scenario, authoring and publishing are usually paired. Not always, but usually. And then finally, you can choose to align your entire workflow operation, your entire publishing operation inside FrameMaker. So in this approach, what you would do is the overall workflow is the same as I described, but for HTML, you would use some of the built-in output options that you have in FrameMaker 2015, or perhaps the TechCom suite, if you want some additional formats and some additional flexibility. Stefan, any important questions up to this point?
There was one question about if you could give an example of what unstructured and structured content is, where the difference is, and there were a little bit feedback about the audio quality from you. So maybe you can adjust your microphone a little bit.
Up, down, sideways, louder. It's always louder. The answer is always louder. All right. So sorry about the mic. I did turn it up a little, and maybe that'll help. Unstructured versus structured. Sorry about that. So unstructured FrameMaker is in the same class or the same category as a Microsoft Word or an InDesign or something like that. It is a word processor. It is paragraph-based and template-based. Now, FrameMaker, we're going to argue, does a much better job of that kind of content, of controlling it, managing it, tables of contents, indexes, cross-references, hyperlinks, that kind of thing. But it is in the same class as something like Microsoft Word. Structured FrameMaker is the XML or structured authoring environment that allows you to create DITA files or other kinds of XML, but specifically DITA. And the big difference between the paragraph-based, template-based FrameMaker, unstructured, and structured FrameMaker is that in structured FrameMaker, you have the ability to set a preferred or a required structure and enforce that using your software. So you can validate your document against the required structure. That means you can do some fun things like require that a list must have 2 bullets or more. You can require that after a heading there is an introductory paragraph. You can require that an article has to have a bibliography. That's at the core of what XML buys you, because structured content is content where you are able to use software to programmatically verify that the content follows the structure or the hierarchy that you're looking for in that content. Okay, so moving from the sort of basic authoring, publishing, deliverable workflows, you might add a CCMS to the mix. So a CCMS is a component content management system. This is a content management system intended specifically for managing small chunks or components of information. And a CCMS is, it's not a prerequisite for using DITA, but if you're going to use DITA and you're going to use a content management system, you really, really need a component content management system. because life in a document-based content management system with all those itty-bitty DITA modules is going to be no fun at all. So if you do add this in, the process gets a little more complex. Again, you can use FrameMaker for several of the components in the workflow. You can use it for authoring and then pushing content into the CCMS, or checking it out, making changes, pushing it back in. You can use it for publishing. You can use it for deliverables. One thing you have to pay attention to here is you want to make sure that your CCMS plays nicely with FrameMaker for authoring and or publishing. There's a much sort of tighter connection there, so you want to make sure that that's going to work. One common approach that we do see here, again, is to use FrameMaker and the PDF publishing capabilities to generate the output that you're looking for and do the authoring potentially in one or more other XML editors. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about AEM, the Adobe Experience Manager, and I did see a portion of the presentation that Dustin did on this early on, so I won't take too much time on this. So AEM, just to clarify, is a web CMS. It is not, or has not until now, been a component content management system. It was originally intended for use in marketing and for sort of marketing-driven websites, or just generally websites. The Adobe team has now released an XML connector for AEM, and what this does specifically is it allows you to store DITA content inside AEM and manage it, and then publish it, in addition to managing and publishing what I would describe as your less structured content. So the distinction I'm making here is that the unstructured content is all the marketing information, your product overviews, product descriptions, maybe data sheets, all the things that go on your website. And then you've got structured content, your DITA content, which is going to be almost certainly your technical communication, technical documentation, and possibly technical training. So in this approach, you use AEM as a DITA repository, in addition to using it also as a repository for your not-so-structured marketing content. And then you can use FrameMaker potentially as your authoring tool to get DITA content into the repository. In this scenario, you are almost certainly going to use AEM's publishing capabilities to publish out to HTML, because what this allows you to do is to actually combine the two, or to deliver a website in which information sourced from the Marcom team and information sourced from the TechCom team appear basically on the same website, and most importantly, have the same look and feel. So it is skinned, or it is formatted in such a way that they look consistent. This is one of the, this is a huge problem we run into daily, if not weekly. People come to us and say, our marketing team has, and then they explain how they create content, which is, for purposes of this discussion, not that interesting, but some way of creating content. And the result is this stuff over here. It looks like this. Okay, now we have TechCom content, which we are creating in DITA, or we are creating in some way, or we want to move it to DITA, and we have tens of thousands of pages in 47 languages, and we need it to look just like the marketing content, and how can we do that? And the canonical answer until now has very often been to re-engineer the marketing look and feel into a separate publications workflow for the technical documentation. The enormous potential of AEM is that it allows us possibly to reuse the publishing and deliverable layer that has already been established for marketing. We can potentially reuse that for technical content. Now, I'm oversimplifying enormously, but that is the general concept, and that is the thing that makes me really very interested in this AEM layer. Now, you'd want to have a conversation with the marketing team about whether they're already using AEM. But if they are, then there's a huge amount of potential here and something to consider. Now, I want to talk a little bit about mixing structured and unstructured content, so I'm glad we got those things combined. But before I do, Stefan, any questions on this?
No, I don't see any questions on this.
Moving on, before somebody asks me a question I can't answer. All right, mixed usage. What I'm talking about here is that we're combining structured content and unstructured content. So going back to the definition, and I'm glad somebody asked, we would have unstructured paragraph-based, word processing documents, essentially, or desktop publishing documents in FrameMaker. And then separately from that, we have some additional content that is actually structured, that is XML, that we need to combine with the unstructured content. Now, we had this happen for a customer. They had an enormous amount of unstructured FrameMaker content and no particular interest or need to move that content into XML. It was fine as it was. But they also had a database full of information that needed to be included as part of their documentation. So what we did with them was we took the database, we pulled XML out of the database, pulled that XML into FrameMaker, and then combined the two. So we had XML structured content and we had unstructured FrameMaker content, but we combined the two into a single deliverable, into a single PDF deliverable. And what this allows us to do is publish content that contains both structured and unstructured information. In many cases, the move to XML can be driven by a specific subset of your information. We weren't going to get the database information out unstructured. It needed to be structured. But there was really no justification for XMLizing or upconverting the unstructured content. It didn't have a problem. The only problem it had was that we needed to put it together with the structured content. So we were actually able to solve this very elegantly in this scenario, and in a way that you really can't do in some other tools because they are XML only. So something to consider there if you have existing unstructured FrameMaker content and you don't really want to move it into structure because you don't need to, you might be able to do something like this. All right, here's another example of this. Markdown is, ironically, a markup language. So Markdown is a way, if you've ever done any editing in a wiki, you've probably used Markdown. You'll see you use an asterisk for a bullet, or you use a tilde to make italics, that kind of thing. So it's a very simple way of marking up content, much, much simpler than XML. And what we have is some cases where customers have people, usually developers, software developers, writing in Markdown. But that Markdown content needs to be included in their deliverables, in their formal TechCom deliverables. So what they end up doing is allowing them to write in Markdown at their convenience, doing whatever. And then when they are done or done enough, or their draft is complete, then we take that draft and we move it into DITA so that the technical writers, technical communicators can do further work on that content, and then it goes through the process. So this is a case where we have mixed authoring initially, and then you eventually align it. So you bring the authoring over into DITA authoring and out of Markdown. Now, there's a really interesting question as to what happens here when you need to do version 2 of your document. Do you take it back to your developers, or do you, do you round trip it, or do you tell them, well, now you have to work in DITA because we've added all this intelligence? It's a tough decision that you have to make there, but something to consider. All right. So there are some other things that you need to do when you decide that you need DITA, right? There are a whole bunch of tasks that you have to complete, and I wanted to touch on those. Things like content modeling, configuration, localization, and part-time authors. Content modeling is the process of looking at your currently unstructured content and saying, how does this match up to my DITA content? How does this match the DITA content model? What metadata will I use in DITA to express the kinds of metadata that I need? Configuration would be the process of putting together all your various tools, getting them to talk to each other, formatting, making your PDF look right, implementing specialization, which I'll talk about in a second. Localization. If you are translating your content, you need to worry about how to configure your authoring process and your authoring environment such that you end up with content that is relatively easier and more efficient to translate and localize. So localization strategy, the process of thinking about this is really critical and often overlooked at the beginning of the project. We have a tendency to only worry about the source language and then worry about all the target languages, all the downstream languages much, much, much later. But I would definitely encourage you to think about localization early. Some of the decisions you make around reuse, for example, can be highly, highly problematic if you make the wrong choices and then try to localize. So just as a general rule of thumb, for example, you might want to maximize reuse by reusing words or swapping out a phrase or putting in an adjective, that kind of thing. Those strategies are going to be really problematic when you translate because not all languages handle the grammar the same way, and when you remove a piece of content like that, you can break the grammar in the other language. So what you typically want to do is reuse at the sentence level or higher, sentences, paragraphs, but not sentence fragments. So to give you an example, I've seen people do singulars and plurals. So they take a word and it says a word, and then they need it to say words, so they delete the A and tack on an S at the end of words, or at the end of word. That works fine in English. It will break all sorts of things when you translate that. So those are the kinds of things you want to not do and limit your reuse so that you don't get in trouble. Okay, part-time authors. It's worth considering what the content creation process will look like for part-time contributors, part-time authors. In many cases, they need only a very, very basic approach. They don't need all the features that your professional full-time authors need. And it's worth considering that to improve their user experience. So you may need actually 2 different authoring environments configured for 2 different sets of users. All right, and I promised to talk about specialization. So I'm very proud of my duck horse, by the way. Specialization is the process of adapting the DITA structure, the default DITA structure, to make it match your particular content and your particular structure. Specialization is a specific thing you can do in DITA. You could take any content model and customize it, but that typically makes it no longer compatible with the original content model. The major feature of DITA specialization is that when you specialize, the result is still considered DITA. It's not considered custom DITA or broken DITA or DITA with some stuff added to it. It is still legal, valid DITA content. Okay, so if you decide to specialize, and that's a major decision, you have to actually implement that content model in DITA, right? So first you have to model the content model and figure out what you need. Then you have to implement it in DITA. Then you have to sort of match up your FrameMaker configuration to that specialization. You have to provide for formatting in your various outputs. Why do you do all this work? Because it improves the match or the alignment between the structure that you're providing and the content that you're authoring. So if, for example, your authors have always put a bibliography at the end of a topic, or they always put a list of references or something like that, you might want to make that section with a list of references mandatory, because you want to be sure that they are going to do that, that they are going to put it in there and not leave it out. So it improves the match between your structure and your content. The problem is you really, really have to weigh the costs and the benefits. Adding specialization into DITA increases the cost of maintaining your structure over time. So you have to make sure that what you're choosing to do here is valuable to you or to your customer, depending on what you're doing. So let me give you an example of this. A few years back, we were contacted by a client, and they asked us to build a specialization of DITA for man pages. Now, man pages, for those of you who are under 30 or so, man pages are a text-based help that is used mostly on Unix systems. And man pages are very useful. You can look up any command. So if you don't know how to use a particular command on Unix, you type in man, as in manual, and then the command, and it'll give you the man page, the help page. So we built a specialization that had all the different man page components, and these are pretty standard. You have the syntax of the command, you have the parameters, you have a description, you have a description of all the parameters, and typically an example. So we made little sections for each one of those. The result then was that people could author content, and then we built a plugin, a custom DITA plugin, that actually turned that DITA man page content into Unix man pages. So you push a button, you generate your output, you get man pages. Now, the really interesting part about this was that, again, this was an example of mixed content, because the man pages the man page DITA was then brought into FrameMaker and formatted as a reference guide and included as a chapter at the end of a document that was actually largely unstructured. But the man page content was brought in from the DITA source and then formatted into PDF or into the final deliverables along with the unstructured content that lived in FrameMaker. So that was a good example of a case where we did a lot of work to do specialization, but it was worthwhile because the payoff, the result was they got automated man page generation and automated generation of this reference material that they needed for their printed or their PDF guides. All right, so a couple of things to consider when you start thinking about this. I've thrown at least 5 or 6 different ways to implement FrameMaker and DITA at you. And the question then becomes, which of these is interesting to you and what is the right choice for you? So the first thing I would look at is, what are your existing PDF requirements? How are you generating PDF? Is that already in FrameMaker? Do you have an investment in really good and potentially complex templates? Because if so, the cost of rebuilding those templates in another system would be significant. So that's something to consider. Secondly, how much existing FrameMaker or TechCom Suite investment do you have? How many licenses do you have that are out there? Would it be relatively a lot less expensive to upgrade or just use those licenses? Or is this a scenario where you're going into it new, in which case you'd have to buy those licenses and, of course, buy whatever other licenses? So if you have a lot of existing investment, it can be quite compelling to take advantage of that and stay with your FrameMaker investment. You want to look at alignment with other parts of your organization. What kinds of tools are they using? Can you get an alignment with them? And if you can't, so can you at least produce content that looks the same? So again, if your marketing organization has AEM, that would be something to take a look at. Can you align with that? If they're using something completely different to produce the web content, how are you going to produce TechCom content that looks at least related? How are you going to do that? I would take a very hard look at the learning curve, not just for your content creators, but also for your technical implementation team. Do they have the skills that you need? Or what skills do they have? Do they have the right skills in order to make this happen? And, that's going to be a huge, huge, huge question mark for them. How are you going to make that work? And then you want to look at your localization requirements. How many languages are you localizing into, if any? How many do you expect to localize into? And how are you going to handle that content production process? Can you align it into whatever your source language production is, or do you need to do it some other way? So those are some big picture things to consider to figure out, are these the right answers, or are they not? How do you pull this all together? Okay, so those are kind of the big picture things that I would look at if somebody comes to me and says, okay, we need to move to DITA. We're not sure where to go. Can we do it with FrameMaker? Should we do it with FrameMaker? Here are some of the questions that I would ask just right off the bat. And with that, I think I'm ready to take some questions with my friend, Mr. Mandarin Duck. What I will do is pull up some contact information, and then I will try and switch over so that I can actually see the Q&A session. I did want to point out the Learning DITA site, learningdita.com, which has a whole lot of DITA 101, how to, just a starting point for learning DITA, and is free. So, what have we got?
Okay. Unfortunately, the chat was cleared at some point. So we're missing a little bit the chat history, but there were a couple of questions, but I think most of them were answered by me or other people. So if I missed to answer a question, we can answer them again if you type them in again. Otherwise, there are a couple of questions from Martin. There is one. So far, unstructured FrameMaker with RoboHelp as a slave is the only reliable way to output PDF, CHN, and other online help formats. At the same time, this does not work with structured FM. Will it work with FrameMaker 2015 in DITA? Let me try to understand that question. RoboHelp as a slave.
I think it should work.
Yeah, it should work. And another possibility, Martin, would be to go through DITA Open Toolkit. We have a session at this conference from Elliot Kimber, and he will explain how to use DITA Open Toolkit with FrameMaker 2015 to publish to other formats. That's one thing. And otherwise, you can, of course... Hello?
Sorry, Stefan. I was going to jump in there and answer... as far as mapping, it absolutely will work with DITA content to publish to other outputs directly from within FrameMaker without using RoboHelp as a slave, as was mentioned here. So, Martin, if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to walk you through that piece.
Yeah. Maybe to make that clear, Martin, you do not need RoboHelp explicitly today any longer in FrameMaker 2015. So even if you don't have RoboHelp, you can publish your FrameMaker content directly to HTML5 and many other formats from within FrameMaker without RoboHelp. Does that answer your question?
My best guess would be that he's using an older version of FrameMaker, a much older version.
Probably, yeah. So, and Didagus is asking, does DITA or structured DITA FM include a real fancy HTML output? I know what you mean with fancy, I guess. DITA, you want to have all the blinks and whistles and everything. FrameMaker comes with a couple of templates for HTML5 output. And they look already pretty fancy, I think. And of course, it's totally up to you to customize them. You can do that through a convenient online editor, visual editor, where you can customize the look and feel of that HTML5 output. And there are a lot of possibilities to make that even more fancy and more customized to your needs.
I believe it is responsive.
And it's responsive HTML5, of course, yes.
So, I mean, fancy is a loaded term.
Fancy is, of course, always an individual thing. personal taste. Madeleine is asking, do we need TechCom Suite or will FrameMaker be sufficient? I'm not sure if I understand to which this relates, to what this is relating.
Right.
If this is about,
so the answer is, of course, it depends.
It depends.
FrameMaker does have some, well, let me back up. FrameMaker will give you everything you need on the authoring side. You do not need TechCom Suite for any sort of publishing, or sorry, for any authoring side work. On the publishing side, TechCom Suite would give you more options than you would have in FrameMaker. Okay, so FrameMaker does give you some out of the box without TechCom Suite, like this responsive HTML5 that we're talking about, and I think also EPUB. But TechCom Suite would give you more options in terms of output. So the answer would be, it depends on what you need, what kinds of outputs that you need. There are some in FrameMaker, there are more in TechCom Suite. And TechCom Suite also includes some additional tools like Captivate, so that would be something. I am not touching the question of what CCMS would you recommend with FrameMaker 2015. The answer is you have to figure out what your requirements are.
Absolutely.
And without knowing what your requirements are, I have no position on that.
Absolutely. And of course, from the Adobe perspective, I just can recommend the XML documentation add-on for Adobe Experience Manager, which is Adobe's DITA CCMS. And this is the closest you can get to the connection between FrameMaker and DITA CCMS, because it's from one company and one platform and one experience. So that might be the best possibility for you.
It will not be the least expensive.
But there are a lot of other CCMS as well.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think that's true. If you want a unified Adobe solution, then that is, I mean, that's certainly the unified Adobe solution. But if that's not your primary or your only consideration, then there would be some other things to look at.
Yeah, especially when you plan to output your technical communication content and go that path of making TechCom part of your marketing communication, then this is a good approach, because then you can manage your data content in AM and also publish it to your corporate website in the technical support area or wherever. And this is what most other CMS, or maybe probably no other CMS can do. And this is a good opportunity. You want to go into that direction.
There's a question here about importing XML. What are the consequences of importing XML data from a CCMS to a CMS such as AEM's add-on? Okay, so let's be very clear. AEM, Adobe Experience Manager, is a CMS. If you add in the XML connector or the XML add-on, then it becomes a CCMS for purposes of your XML and DITA. So in terms of consequences, I don't think there should be any, unless there are some initial limitations on if you're doing some really weird DITA things that it doesn't quite support yet. But there shouldn't, so when we talk about a CCMS, and we're comparing a CCMS to AEM's add-on, those are both CCMSs. It would be if you imported into AEM without the XML add-on that you might have some consequences, which is a word I like very much. Okay, is there a way to reduce the number of options from DITA that the author can use? Yes. You can look into specialization, which I mentioned, and there's also something called constraints. And constraints allow you essentially to take away options. They allow you to take away elements and provide fewer elements to the end user. So you can reduce the DITA element set down just to the ones that you want them to use.
Yeah, and you can also control this in a not that restrictive, but in a simple way through the template for DITA. So you could set easily in the element dialog of FrameMaker, you can easily say, oh, these elements, I don't want them. I don't even show them to the author as available elements. And then he only sees a reduced list of available elements. But this is not so restrictive like doing a proper constraint, so that's probably the better way, but depends on how easy you want to have it. So there are a lot of options in FrameMaker for that. Okay, did we miss something?
Well, there's a couple here. You have to create unique transforms to publish to your various deliverables. I hate to say it depends again, but if you are using the DITA Open Toolkit and you have a variety of deliverables, so let's say you're outputting HTML and EPUB and 3 different kinds of PDF and some crazy man pages and some other things, then yes, typically those would be individual transforms. However, and that's where the it depends comes from. For example, if I have an HTML web output transform, and I also have an EPUB transform, it's likely that I can reuse a lot of the HTML transform. EPUB is basically HTML in a zip file. The .epub is really a zip file. It's got a couple of extra manifest files and some other stuff like that. So in theory, you can create an HTML transform and then create sort of a superset of that transform that includes the EPUB. So it wouldn't necessarily be 2 standalone transforms, but it might be. And the more different the transforms are, the more likely that you do need unique transforms. Let's see, what else do we have? I think that's it, unless there are other questions. I think I've made my way to the bottom here. Let's see, would an HTML5 publication be a justification for having TCS? HTML5 is actually in FrameMaker, built in. So you probably can't use that directly. But if you already have all the pieces and parts, my guess would be that the licensing is going to be very little different than licensing them all separately. It might actually be cheaper, so, or at least comparable. I think you're much better off, if you have all the parts, you're much better off getting the TechCom suite than you are having the company was adamant. Well, yes, been there, done that. Stefan, did we lose you? Oh, yeah, Stefan,
Just a second answer.
Oh, there you are. Nope, just trying to make sure we didn't lose you. You went silent, and that can't be. Yeah, it's Dustin's fault. It's cheating. Okay, I will, Stefan, you said you are going to post recordings potentially. I can post the slides, but you said you were going to post recordings perhaps, if you can get them to work. I will post the slides probably on SlideShare. So if anybody wants them, you can contact me directly or contact the Adobe team, whatever makes sense, and take it from there. Are there any short examples available what a structured data operations manual looks like? That's a good question, and a lot of people ask that question. A lot of people are looking for sample content. There is some sample data actually included in, for example, the DITA Open Toolkit. I'm not saying it's great, but that does exist. Somebody has started a list of examples of DITA content in the wild. Remind me, send me an email if you don't mind, and I will dig that up. I can't remember where it is off the top of my head, but I know it exists. So I can try and find that. And as they're mentioning, I'm also on Twitter, so I will post it there as soon as I figure out where it's hiding. Okay. So anything else?
Okay. I guess we need to close the session anyway. Please make sure to follow Sarah on Twitter and get updates from her. And if you have any other questions, feel free to contact us at techcom@adobe.com, and we'll be happy to connect with you. I would like to stop the recording now. Thanks again, Sarah, for this presentation. Thanks to everyone who was attending this presentation and is still in the room or is currently joining in. So that's it for this session. We start the next session in about 10 minutes. And so you can have a small break and grab a coffee or whatever. And then we will be back in 10 minutes.
Okay, great question.